Good morning. I'm Dick Kell, Chair of the Warren Centre Humanitarian Engineering Hub, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar this morning. I shall start proceedings by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where each of us is located, wherever that may be within our nation. We pay our respects to all of our First Nations peoples and their leaders, past, present and emerging, and we recognise and celebrate their history, culture and achievements. I welcome you all to this webinar on the very important subject of safeguards in international development projects. It has been organised, of course, by the Warren Centre Humanitarian Engineering Hub. The Hub has been established to provide a forum for the promotion of best practice humanitarian engineering within the context of international development and disaster relief. If you are not already a member of the Hub, you are most welcome to join. The link will be provided later in the webinar. I remind you that this event is being recorded, and I remind you also that our program has time for questions. Please make use of the Q&A function to pose your questions, and our panelists will address as many as they can at the end of the presentations. And please keep your questions as concise as possible. Our webinar this morning is on the critical issue of environmental and social safeguards in international development projects. Safeguards save lives. We have been able to bring together a panel of 4 outstanding practitioners in international development, each from a different background, but each a leader in his field. David Werra is Secretary of the Department of Works of PNG. Ross Butler is with the World Bank. Sam Sasega is an experienced consultant from Samoa, and Tim Simpson is from DFAT AIFFP. More details will be given shortly. And I do note that our speakers are connected from Mongolia, from Apia in Samoa, from Port Moresby in PNG, and Canberra and Brisbane. So it's I think a wonder of modern technology that we can do this. And I'm delighted that we have as our moderator, Joe Baldesky. Joe is a social scientist and passionate international development practitioner with a bachelor's degree in social science and graduate certificates in development planning and social impact. She holds an executive role with Cardno International Development, where she leads the Impact and Safeguards Advisory. In this role, she is accustomed to leading and working within teams comprising engineers of all disciplines, together with environmentalists, social scientists, health and other professionals, and with construction contractors on humanitarian and post-disaster projects. For more than 15 years, Joe has worked on projects in Australia, PNG, including Bougainville, Myanmar, Nauru, Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Tonga, Tuvalu and Vanuatu, on projects across the energy, transport infrastructure, water and wastewater, urban and regional planning and resources sectors. She is, as you will realise, eminently experienced and qualified in safeguards to moderate our session. I'll now turn over the control over to Joe, who will introduce the panelists and define safeguards for us and get the show on the road. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Dick. You always manage to make me sound a lot more impressive than I actually am, I think, but thank you for the kind introduction. We might just jump straight into a bit of a quick introduction to what we see or understand safeguards to mean before we get into the nitty-gritty of our conversations. And I think we will have some really interesting conversations today. So I hope you're all ready for some interesting debates. I'm not sure the full breadth of the understanding of all the audience today, so I thought it would be really useful to have a 5-minute intro into what safeguards actually mean and the way that we use them at the moment in this day and age. So, both humanitarian and development projects present similar challenges, so we'll be talking about those interchangeably, despite recognizing that there are some major differences. In the end, in every situation that we'll be talking about, outsiders with expertise come to communities with an identified need to provide inputs on projects to support the achievement of larger development or humanitarian goals. Countries that are considered less economically developed, and we'll come back to that term maybe later, are eligible for funding from development banks, which we call multilateral donors, and other countries, which we call bilateral donors. People may mobilise to build a hydropower dam or a road, but when we work in this sector, building the thing is not the end goal. It's the means to an end. The end may be connecting communities to health and social services. It might be enhancing opportunities for economic development or training and employment. It may be lowering the cost of living as all food has to be shipped in and freight costs are prohibitive. In Australia and other advanced economies, construction projects are very well regulated. The protections embedded in legislation and with the institutional strength to back those up and implement the controls is something many of us take for granted. Not only do we have engineering standards and building codes, but also the instruments that support social and environmental protection. This isn't the case in many of these developing economies, where legal protections for people and the environment can be patchy, prejudicial, a little bit behind the times, or just simply not well enforced. So if you're a development partner wanting to provide some assurance of environmental and social management for the projects that you support, in the knowledge that the legislative and regulatory frameworks vary wildly from country to country, what would you do? You might develop some minimum standards as a condition of your financing. Makes perfect sense, right? But they weren't always a thing. World Bank, for example, at its inception after the Second World War, lenders and financiers assumed that good planning principles, and by that I mean principles like don't build a chemical factory next to a children's hospital, or don't build a sewage treatment plant upstream from a pristine water source. So those good planning principles and local legislation would be sufficient protections, they assumed. They basically realized that that wasn't going to work over time. And one of the most infamous cases was the Narmada Dam in India, when over 140,000 people were displaced, sparking worldwide controversy. And a movement trying to get attention to that was really largely driven by civil society organizations. So it was only around the 1980s that the banks started to utilize environmental and social safeguard policies. They'd be incrementally adjusted every few years, leading to the development of the OPs, the operational policies, and most recently, the newest version of the World Bank Group Safeguard Policies, which is the ESF, the Environmental and Social Framework, which came into force a few years ago. The reason that they're reviewed and updated, some more than others, is because safeguards have to respond to emerging issues, social science, and environmental data, things that we only often just learn from working on projects and from science. The basic principle of all safeguards is do no harm. Do no harm to the environment, water, biodiversity, ecosystems, air quality. Do no harm to the communities where you're working, so whether that's not affecting where people live or how they make their livelihoods, access to resources. Do no harm to the workers on the project. And that journey's been ongoing just as it has been in advanced economies as well. And do no harm to the vulnerable people in these areas, whether that's Indigenous people, women, children, people with disabilities, and now a growing movement to ensure that that's sexual minorities and identities and recognition of all of those various forms and intersectionality of vulnerability. And so each development partner actually has its own set of these policies or safeguards and expects compliance. And the compliance with those policies is a condition of disbursement of funds. The split and how it's organised by each agency is quite arbitrary, and depending on the donor, some elements can fall outside, either social or environmental. For example, the Asian Development Bank talks about gender as very much outside of the safeguards framework, whereas others have very specific gender safeguards. Look, I think in the end, most of it makes, it just uses common sense in the way that it's conceptualized. But I think what I'd like to leave you with is that realizing that physical infrastructure projects like large road networks or ports can contribute to the overarching development goals of the country in like a macro sense. But if inappropriately managed at a community level or even household level, they can actually have negative impacts that can compound poverty, they can compound inequality, they can affect access to resources, they can even cause trauma. They can block safe access to livelihoods, schools, they can resume the subsistence lands of a family or a whole community. They can bring outside influences to insulated communities or force people to move away from land that they've lived on for generations, all of which can have unforeseen and compounding consequences. Inappropriately managed projects can lead to harassment, abuse, human trafficking, forced labour, death. Often the result of insufficient due diligence, unintended consequences of construction projects can actually be really surprising. Can you consider that Western ideas of women's empowerment, for example, and their participation in decision-making, setting targets for women's participation on projects, and how they're programmed into these projects can actually lead to gender-based violence and increasing levels of gender-based violence in a community? Can you consider that providing job opportunities in one place can make source communities vulnerable, leading to school dropouts, substance abuse, urban drift of working-age people away from rural areas and leaving other communities more vulnerable? Can you imagine that building a road could lead to an STD breakout and high levels of youth pregnancy, solo parenting, and reduced education completion rates? Ultimately, the underpinning promise of safeguards policies for development funding is that no person should be worse off as a result of a development funding project. And you can't achieve this without having a framework through which to make sure you don't miss anything. And what that really all comes down to, no matter how you slice it, is that it all comes back to good environmental and social management. That means screening projects, identifying risks and impacts, managing risks and impacts, and monitoring to making sure that those sorts of concepts and controls are placed, are implemented appropriately. So I think we'll come back to some of these ideas throughout each of our conversations today. But I hope that was a bit of an introduction that helps position where we're going with this and building up the importance of these sorts of controls for people who do work in the sector, especially all those engineers out in the world wanting to make their mark and make a difference. I'd really love to hand over to Dick now to introduce our next eminent speaker.
Thank you, Joe. Our first speaker is David Werra, or our first panelist. He'll make a brief presentation and then serve on the panel. David is Secretary of the PNG Department of Works and Implementation, responsible for all main roads and government buildings throughout PNG. David has held that role for about 8 years or so. He may correct me when he speaks. The work the department undertakes is very challenging because of the terrain, the isolation, the fact that there are many islands as well as the main area of PNG, and the lack of resources. So he undertakes the most challenging role in undertaking maintenance and upgrading and construction of new roads. He is a civil engineer and highly experienced and an outstanding manager. David has called upon people in PNG to not compete but to complement each other in order to work together to make PNG a better place. And I think that's an indication of David's approach, that he believes in collaboration and getting people to work together. So it's my pleasure to ask David now to give a brief introduction. Thank you, David.
Video too. I'll put the video on. Thank you. Am I online?
You are. Thank you, David.
Okay, thank you. I think I put my presentation on this one.
Go ahead, David.
Thank you, Dick, for that introduction, and the team who are zooming into this important meeting. I'm very happy to participate. Some experiences from PNG. Social safeguards are always a very important aspect of development projects we are doing in the country, and for PNG it's very difficult. It's lots of challenges in trying to properly implement the safeguard requirements. As Dick has said, the land in PNG is 95% of the land in PNG is owned by customary. It's under customary domain, and also in terms of natural disasters, there are a lot of areas in the country that's prone to floods, prone to earthquakes, and many other natural disasters, and the impacts on the development projects we do are very quite huge. And today I'll be talking about the challenges and the impacts and importance of safeguards on the projects, on road projects in PNG. Department of Works is and Highways. We just changed our name from under the reforms we've done recently. The Department of Works has changed its name from Department of Works and Highways. So we have a dedicated division now that's in charge of the main highways, which we call the economic lifeline highways, and other road sections, including the provincial and district roads under our field operations. And we are in charge of a total of 30,000 kilometers. Government's medium-term plan is now to open up additional 2,000 kilometers of greenfield, and already some work have started on those greenfields, as government intends to now connect the country with improved road network to link people, business, and other important activities on on better roads. So the challenges we face are, we're building roads into a very rugged terrain areas. We experience a lot of wet tropical weather. In some parts of the country are identified as active seismic zones. We got so many villages and communities that are still disconnected. And the challenges of network needs versus priorities of political priorities. While we develop plans on the basis of greater impact, we also have our leaders who come up with their own priorities as well, and the competition that is on the limited resources we have. All in all, we are currently spending approximately about 1 billion per year. This is an allocation that has increased over the last few years. The road-related budget appropriations and fundings has been very low after we have done a lot of work in carrying out awareness and closely working with the government and the people who do the budget in the country. Funding for roads have increased. And of this funding we're receiving every year, 40% of this comes from our multilateral and bilateral partners, especially ADB, World Bank, and Australian aid gives us a lot of support. And 60% of it comes from the GOPNC, government of PNC funding. Majority of these works are contracted out. In those contracts, the social safeguards are now becoming more and more important part of the contracts, and which contractors are required to implement those requirements and guidelines that are clearly set out in the contract. But in terms of implementation, the challenges are still huge. We still have discarded population who are living along those corridors, who continues to express their dissatisfaction, express their concerns about the impacts of socio-environmental impacts that these big road projects are creating along these corridors. And with our donor partners, especially the donor and loan funded projects, the requirements of the social safeguards are very strong. And I'm happy to say that for donor and loan funded projects, our performance in achieving those social safeguard targets and the goals requirements has improved a lot. There hasn't been much issues. But on the government of PNG funded programs, as I've said, the land is still under the customary domain, and people take matters to court. There are a lot of issues, pending court challenges at this stage. And over the last 8 years, I've been Secretary of Works. I've referred, what we have done at the department is that we have referred a lot of these issues to the court, and I'm happy that the courts have done a very good job, where a lot of these claims that the landowners and communities living along the road have put up against the state has been thrown out. So far, we have saved the state about 500 million kina. That's about $500 million kina in terms of court case claims that have been brought up against the state. So we also, while we are also looking for different ways to engage and make the communities living along the road become partners in development. For example, under the ADB program up in the Highlands, it's a multi-billion kina program to develop, maintain, and improve 2,000 kilometers of important trunk roads. And Islands region is where a lot of these economic activities are very prominent, and it supports the country's growth in a big way. And this is where the focus of the loan arrangement, loan spending is aligned to important areas. And what we have done in the Islands region is that instead of paying a bit of compensation using the rates and values and rates that the lands department has set, we've now looked at communities and look at community programs, community developments, like building a classroom, buying a vehicle for schools and aid posts in those areas. And this is working very well in those communities up in the Highlands. And it's one of the, we've made this practice now a standard policy across the other country on other programs that we are doing road projects, other funding arrangements that we are doing road projects all around the country. And it's working very well. And you know, PNG is a very diverse country, and one model doesn't work, can't fit all the regions and all the provinces and all the districts. So but the approach to look at a community-based projects and then paying individual is a model that is been bought into by our communities, and we feel that this is the way to go, and we'd like to use this a lot more on our other road projects we are doing. On some of the new missing links we are doing, new connections in green fields. We're doing our best to minimize the environmental impacts on these new areas. Important thing is reaching the communities that are isolated in this part of the country, and bringing them on board, taking ownership of these important road services to link them. Carrying out more awareness has been very important, and it's working. What we are doing is we also buying some mobile sawmills, giving it to the community so they can cut trees and bring up their own building materials, give them a bit of roofing iron, and look at a permanent housing scheme for them along those corridors and improve their living conditions. So we're looking at different options in different places, and slowly monitoring them and see what the outcomes are like, and eventually turn these models that are working into a national policy, and continue to work together with the people and locals in those impacted and affected areas. And with the roadworks, our local communities benefit from the employment opportunities, business opportunities, the improved road services in terms of transport, telecommunication, access to health and education in those remote areas, as well as on the corridors, on the main corridors where roads are already existing, and where we are improving, upgrading those roads to standard highways. As I said, land disputes are big issues in the country, and we are very mindful of this all the time, because a lot of this land is still in the customary hand, and bringing a development service to these areas has to be done with a lot of negotiation with the landowners, the customary landowners, people on the ground, and it's done in a way that we bring the lands department and many other government organizations together to deal with these issues by identifying the right landowners and look at what a genuine, reasonable amount for those the payments for the land, and other impacts, other challenges and other costs that involve with the use of land in those villages, those communities, and those areas. As I said, for projects funded under the donors and development partners, high standards, we want to see that we fully implement those social safeguard requirements, which we are applying in the conditions of roads and bridge contracts, and environmental protection required by the Environment Act, include community rights and well-being, include community engagement and safety, avoidance of unintended consequences and delays. And those are always made important part of the contract, which the contractor must develop a plan to implement those environmental and social safeguard requirements during the construction period. Lessons learned from the past. A lot of the land along these corridors where we're building roads have never been acquired. These were still under the customary land, and we just put through roads, and now we have a big issue where the landowners have become aware of the need for government to acquire their land properly. And we're facing a number of issues, but there are many legal issues, and there are also work disruption issues on the site where many of our construction activities are always held up and delayed. Inadequate public information and stakeholder, poor community buy-in into the projects, poor and sometimes negative community responses. These are costly, very costly. Sometimes we see the delays are costly. Sometimes we even go to the extreme of working with the law enforcement agencies to carry out awarenesses on those sections. And I'm happy to say that slowly the mindset is changing, and people are taking ownership. People are cooperating well in some parts of the country, and we just have to continue to bring people on board so they understand. I think awareness and understanding the need and importance of road services to help them, empower them, and encourage them also to go back to land and do something worthwhile so they can utilize this improved road access to markets and help themselves. I think this kind of information and awareness is very important, and it's working very well in parts of the country, and this is the approach we'd like to continue to look at. I think that's about all, and thank you very much, Dick and the team.
Thank you very much, David. That was terrific. Back to Joe.
Thank you so much, Secretary Wera. I think it's really fascinating for people who may not have had exposure to PNG and the difficulties of working in these sorts of contexts to get a bird's eye view of the situation. Really appreciate the time you took to share that with us. Next speaker on the line is Ross Butler. Now, Ross has been the social risk coordinator for the World Bank's China and Mongolia portfolio since August 2019. Prior to this, he actually held the same role in the World Bank Sydney office, where he was responsible for the Papua New Guinea and Pacific Islands region, which is where many of us know him from. His work in the World Bank has focused on working with governments, contractors, communities, and other stakeholders, including other development partners, to strengthen the management of social risk and to optimize social development outcomes in World Bank supported operations. And I must say that he does this passionately. Prior to joining World Bank in 2013, Ross worked in the headquarters of the Asian Development Bank, where he worked in both Southeast Asian and Central West Asian departments. Ross, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Just checking you can hear me okay. I will.
Can hear you perfectly, thank you.
Okay. Let me, okay. So good morning, everybody. And thank you very much, Secretary Wera, for your presentation. It actually it links nicely to mine, even insofar as the title is concerned. We have, I called my short presentation for this morning From Aspiration to Delivery, which is exactly what you do every day. And I know that there's been a lot of shared learning. I think some of the issues you identified are super important, and PNG, few countries present a more challenging environment than PNG for the delivery of essential infrastructure. So many lessons are to be learned from PNG and from your department and others. So let me just, I'm going to have a look at the same issues that the Secretary spoke about, but from the World Bank, from the Multilateral Development Bank perspective. So as a starting point, you know, when we talk about safeguards and humanitarian engineering, as a starting point, the development exercise that we all try and contribute to in a meaningful way is by its nature aspirational. It is by its nature, we are all collectively trying to contribute to a preferred condition, to better outcomes for communities and the environment they live in. So to a certain extent, it's a world of shifting goalposts, because there's always room for improvement. As Secretary Were very neatly summarized, the role of monitoring and learning and rolling these improvements into the next project is fundamental to the development project. It's not a linear intellectual exercise. And it's founded in the infrastructure space. I mean, this conversation is primarily around infrastructure-based development projects. There's many others, of course, but the focus this morning is on infrastructure. If well conceived, planned, and delivered, they can be fundamentally important to people's lives, and can make meaningful and measurable improvements in the socioeconomic structures in places and communities, and contribute to economic development outcomes. The opposite, though, is equally true. So if the infrastructure projects either, you can have a fantastically well delivered project, but it's the wrong project in the wrong place. Or you can have a project that's really needed in a certain location to join A and B, say a road, but it's poorly delivered for whatever reason. There's a myriad of reasons that may be the case. So the question is, how do we build E&S, risk management, and into the development process, as Secretary Were outlined, is happening in PNG, which was actually fantastic to hear. What's been happening in PNG, and I haven't worked there for about 3 or 4 years. So the consideration of E&S risks and opportunities by everybody is required. And I say opportunities because it's not just about risks. I mean, to a certain extent, we're talking about risks. How do we make this not so bad? But really, we're looking at all sorts of development outcomes from a piece of infrastructure, and that's the kind of infrastructure plus outcome that that everybody's after, especially the communities, but also everybody who works on the project, whether you're helping to finance it or deliver it. So, I mean, why are E&S assessments important? I mean, generally speaking, obviously, we know why, but it's always worth restating. The purpose is to ensure that the people and environment are protected from potential adverse impacts, and they also help optimize the positive impacts and outcomes. As Secretary Were I just outlined in PNG, the role of citizen engagement, the role of consultation with the community, understanding the needs and expectations of the people, has a massive impact on the quality of the project, but it also has a very measurable impact on timing, cost, budget, contract delays, all that project management headache, which quickly translates into a political and reputational headache. And these are often very easily avoided. The purpose of these things is to allow for informed decision making. I mean, the purpose of assessments is to allow people making the decisions to know what the situation is on the ground. And then from a World Bank perspective, it's to work with governments to improve sustainability and the quality of projects beyond the World Bank portfolio. Secretary Were referred to, there's a difference between the development partner funded operations and the locally funded operations. But over time, that blurs. And over time, the good practices, hopefully introduced by institutions like the World Bank and supported by the bank, flow through to the way things are done, which has a massive multiplier effect. The billion kina the Secretary Were referred to, I think it's about 240 million USD a year. You know, so substantial money into the overall portfolio. So, as Joe mentioned earlier, the policies started as, and still are conceived by some as to do no harm. That's the purpose. And at a bare minimum, it kind of still is. But they're actually so much more than that. And the more contemporary or modern policy frameworks of the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, and the bilaterals, such as Australia, Japan, and others, now call for a full consideration of ENS aspects. And partly that relates to improving development outcomes. It relates largely to improving environmental and social performance, obviously, but it also relates to facilitation of good project delivery. And as I've kind of indicated before, they can be risks, bad things, to be managed and mitigated, or opportunities to be maximized. I've just put there in terms of risk management through design, etc., because experience shows that with a quality ENS assessment, which is fed into the project thinking and project management and delivery, many significant improvements can be made very cheaply, often through design, often through small tweaking, and risk can be avoided, and the benefits can be optimized. Again, as Secretary Were gave a great list of examples in Papua New Guinea around context, the physical context of Papua New Guinea and elsewhere in the Pacific and elsewhere. I'm in Mongolia at the moment, so it's completely different. So we need to look at issues that are relevant to Mongolia. We don't try to translate Papua New Guinea lessons, if they're completely irrelevant, into Mongolia, obviously. So it depends on context. Sectors are different. Some sectors are just easier. Roads invariably are really hard, really important, and they have a huge development impact, but they're also really hard. And funding arrangements, who's in the mix? Often there might be the World Bank and the ADB and the Australians, and obviously local funding, and we sometimes bring our own issues into projects. I have to say, from a development partner perspective, we are all getting a lot better at coordinating ourselves so that we're not a burden, and in fact that we are actually very constructive in the manner in which we support the environmental and social aspects of projects. Right, so this is the question that we often have, as a practitioner. Many discussions with Dick, Secretary Were, and others. My job is to deliver the road. I need to deliver this project, and I need to do it before the wet season, which is now only 6 months or 3 or 4 months away, and I have a lot of work to do. So how do what you're doing, Ross, how does this help me? And it's often in the heat of the moment, it's a difficult question to answer because often you're only a month or two away from the wet season, and now it's a mad rush. But that is rectified by building this into the project DNA and project management system. So it's all designed for and structured through. It's just another part of the project delivery architecture. Environmental and social assessments provide an early warning. You know, they identify the community issues, the social impacts, the location of the schools, and there might be little things. The village, the small village on a road that's going to be resealed. We can see actually that there's going to be a road safety issue there. So let's think about it super early, put in, make sure we have in the bidding documents an expectation from the contractor to design and construct their way around that, whether it's signage, speed humps, whatever. The solutions always are different depending on the situation, but it needs to be thought about. If we don't ask people to think about solving this issue, it probably won't get solved. And it'll be picked up later on when there's an issue. By then it's already a headache. By then already somebody's been hurt or killed, and avoidably. And this is the sort of thing we're trying to avoid. So they do play a very important role in early warning. Improving project design identifies the issues. It can test assumptions around what this project will deliver, and everybody has a different perspective on that. I'm biased, but you know, most development outcomes actually relate to environmental and social issues, improved livelihoods, economic, social, community access to healthcare, education, etc. So it's super important part of the overall outcome of infrastructure delivery. So it goes without saying that it needs to be understood. And savings. I mean, if effective ENS assessments save money, save time. They seem like a pain up front, but as I said before, if you feed it into the early thinking of the design and delivery and feed it through the procurement process and design process, it saves a lot of money in delays and delay claims, and also political pressures from that can happen with delays. So what causes a safeguard problem? You know, that's often I get called to my director's office in Beijing all the time around, we've got a safeguard problem with the project. In fact, usually it's not. These are issues which exist. They just haven't been identified and managed. You know, it's not the policy or us necessarily creating the discontent in the community around the road being built with inadequate consultation. That is just a situation on the ground. And the point being that we need to understand it early so it can inform decision-making appropriately. So there's that. Poor assessments, poor implementation is another thing. Often assessments are made and design and assessment might be done a few years before the road's delivered. And the people may not be spoken with in between. There may have been a flood come through or a storm event or something that's changed the context, or a new mayor, anything can happen, has changed the context in which that project sits, and the documents haven't been updated. So this just leads to substandard outcomes. And that relates obviously to the inability to address changes and adaptively manage through the project cycle, which is the last one there. if we don't do the right work up front and build it into the DNA of the project, the wrong decisions will be made at the start, and that will start a cascading series of misinformed decisions and invariably under-resourcing. And another fundamental common issue is failures in engaging with the community and feedback mechanisms, which Secretary Were referred to the importance of that on the ground. And this is just, where engineers and safeguards intersect. These are just some random photos, I think, that show the one on the left was built as a temporary water supply when the water supply for a village was upset as a result of a project. And that was a hole the contractor built. I have no idea about the water quality, but there's no fencing or anything, just simple things to stop the 3-year-olds falling in, a $20 fence or a different solution, super simple. Engineers are super at this work, but we just need to see it. Then on the right, this is just, here in UB, again, an overpass, no pedestrian access through construction. I did a bit of homework on this. There is a way of walking, but it's not signposted. It's not lit. There's nothing. It's completely unattractive and perhaps more dangerous than actually walking on the main road. So these things are easy and cheap to address through construction. On the left there, we have the guys working on the Gabion wall, but all hooked on with harnesses, hard hats, cheap stuff, like very economical, but it can save a life. The purpose of development funded operations is not to send people home either injured or maimed or in a box. That is the opposite of what we're seeking to achieve. So a lot of these things are cheap and systems based. Put your harness on and hook it on, and then you're quite safe. Simple things, they're just mindset things. And on the right, it's just, a question around design, construction, supervision, whether or not the tactile tiles in that footpath are even required. This footpath is only 3 years old. But again, it's here in Mongolia, where, for 3 months of the year, it's like minus 40 degrees Celsius, incredibly difficult challenges. But it needs to be designed for. Perhaps you don't need a footpath that wide. Perhaps you don't need the tactile tiles. Perhaps there's all sorts of different solutions there, but that needs to be thought through up front. Otherwise, a contractor just goes and delivers the wrong thing because other people didn't perhaps put enough thought into what's really required. And that's the end of my short presentation. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Ross. I always love listening to you speak. There's always such insights there. You can tell you've been in this space for so long. You've really nailed down those learnings that you get from the field. Next, and thank you all for your patience. We are running a little bit behind schedule and we will still have a really cool panel discussion. It just may be a little bit shorter than we'd planned. But I'm really excited to introduce Sam Sasega to speak. And I'm so glad he was able to join us today because I really wanted everyone on this webinar to have the opportunity to hear from a practitioner based out in the Pacific. Sam's a Samoan national and a safeguards specialist operating out of Apia in Samoa. His academic background actually is in forestry, and he holds a Master in Science in Resource Management from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Sam started working as a consultant a decade ago, and before that, he was the head of the Division of the Environment for the Government of Samoa in 1991 to 1994. He's worked as an advisor for the Secretariat for the Pacific Community, which some of you may know as SPC, in the mid-90s. and as a resource management advisor for SPREP, the Secretariat for the Pacific Regional Environment Program. Sam's experience in social safeguards has been mainly with ADB and World Bank throughout the Pacific Island countries. In the last 5 years alone, he's worked in the Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Samoa, Fiji, and Tuvalu. So thank you and welcome, Sam. And I can't wait to hear about the example you're going to share with us today.
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me? I think I've lost the...
We can hear you very well. Thank you.
And I'm assuming that you'll be operating my PowerPoint presentation from your end?
Just bringing it up now. Thank you.
Well, as Joe had given you a brief background of my working experience, but after working for the government and SPC and SPREP for that period of time, I thought it would be good to go out to the private sector and try and see how what it's like to be there. So I've been working as a consultant since 2012, initially in a partnership with two other colleagues, but no, 2000 and yeah, since 2012, I've been working in a number of ADB and World Bank funded projects throughout the Pacific, mostly Samoa, FSM, and the other countries that have been mentioned. Yes, slide change. Next slide. I think you've heard from both Joe and Ross the significance of social safeguards and environmental safeguards in the design of development projects. I'd like to highlight the fact that these safeguards requirements are particularly relevant for Pacific Island countries, largely because Pacific Island countries are small. Most, I suppose, other than Papua New Guinea, maybe Solomons, Vanuatu, and Fiji, most Pacific Island countries are low-lying. Many are atolls, highly vulnerable to climate change and natural hazards, and with economies that are fairly small and also very susceptible to fluctuations in international commodity prices, especially imported fossil fuels. Because of these characteristics, development projects, especially infrastructure projects, invariably directly affect people, their land, their sources of livelihoods and income, their access to other resources, communally shared resources that may not be directly affected by a project, as well as their cultural and environment, the cultural resources and natural resources and environment. Consequently, it's very important that the technical and engineering designs of projects must be environmentally and socially responsible, especially to the needs of vulnerable peoples to be able to be sustainable in the long term. For these reasons, environmental and social safeguards are integral to sound project design to ensure adverse impacts of projects on people and environment are avoided or effectively mitigated. I think this you've heard from in previous presentations. But as I said, these requirements are particularly acutely relevant in the context of Pacific Island countries because of their smallness and because of their vulnerability to both environmental and natural hazards. Next slide, please. I want to speak specifically as an example of a project that I've been involved in Kiribati. This is called the South Tarawa Renewable Energy Project. Now, I think it's important to understand the context of this particular country. It's a least developing country. It's a low-lying, consists of low-lying atoll, and it's highly vulnerable to sea level rise and all the other climate-induced impacts. And economically, it's also a least developing country. Let me just get something out. Okay. Kiribati has a population of 118,000 people in 2021. Now, this particular project located in South Tarawa. South Tarawa is about 51% of the total population of Kiribati. 25% of households in South Tarawa live below the basic needs poverty line. And the life expectancy here is 56 years for males and 63 years for females. This is according to World Health Organization in 2020. Unemployment is extremely high at 31%. It's very, overcrowding is a major problem, resulting in unemployment of youth, very high unemployment of youth, poor housing, poor hygiene, and high incidence of communicable diseases. Sanitation is a major issue and a major problem, with only 29% of households using flush toilets in South Tarawa, 22% still practicing open defecation, mainly on the beach, in the sea, in the bush, and so forth. 90% of households in South Tarawa itself uses electricity for lighting, and 55% use kerosene for cooking. Now, the South Tarawa Renewable Energy Project is set within this socio-economic context. The overall objective of the project is to increase access to a reliable supply of affordable electricity for the residents of South Tarawa. And the project aims to install 5 megawatts of solar PVs, 13 megawatt hours of battery energy storage system, as well as associated grid infrastructure with modern control systems. The project is to be located in an area of 13 hectares that has been earmarked for renewable energy projects. Strip in particular will occupy 5.3 hectares of this area. At the time of social assessment, the land is occupied illegally by some households, and the entire area is used by the surrounding community for various purposes. Next slide, please. Now, this is for those of you who may not be familiar with Kiribati. It's north of Fiji and northwest of Australia, west of Papua New Guinea. The atoll of Tarawa is highlighted there where the project location is. Next slide. I've also got some images here of South Tarawa itself. The first one, left-hand corner, shows on the right side the airport, and to the north of the airport is the area that is earmarked for the project in green. And those are typical sites of dwellings and in the local communities, including the community of South Tarawa. The PV panels you see there actually was taken from an existing PV installation on one side of the area that is earmarked for this project. You can see people drawing water from wells. That large thatched house is a community meeting house or maniapa that is used for social gatherings, also used for hosting visitors from outer islands that do come for visit to Saftara. Next slide. Now, in the preparation of this project, because the project triggers ADB safeguards policy on environment as well as voluntary resettlement. It is categorized as a Category B project. This is a project that has significant environmental and social impacts, but these impacts are not irreversible. They can be mitigated with existing measures for mitigation. So it's a Category B project. And in doing a social assessment of this project, we undertook a whole series of consultations with all stakeholders that were identified in a consultation and engagement plan. These stakeholders are not only government agencies, but as well NGOs, village groups, women's groups and organizations, and local community as well. We had these initial meetings to introduce the project, to explain to them the initial concept and the design that we have. And then we also had another round of consultation after we had a preliminary design for the project. And then another consultation at towards the end when we finalized more or less the design of the project. In each of these consultations, we invited comments and inputs from all stakeholders and took note of these and continually revise and review the project so that we could incorporate into the design those concerns and issues that are relevant to this particular project. Now, aside from the consultation, we also carried out a socioeconomic survey, and basically 100% all the households surrounding the project area. And this came to about 502 households. And in these, we asked questions about collecting information on household characteristics, incomes, sources of incomes, also on information on the energy sources, water sources, and the conditions of sanitations and so forth. We were also particularly interested in identifying households that and the levels of income, and households that were headed by women, as well as households that had people with disabilities. These were amongst the groups that we categorized as particularly vulnerable groups within this community. Now, some of the key findings of that is listed here. We found that surrounding communities depend on biomass for more than 80% of their energy for cooking. Biomass meaning dry leaves and stems and so forth from not only the vegetation around the houses, but also vegetation within the area that is earmarked for the project. Biomass is partly collected from the area to be fenced off for the project. We also found that if the area is to be fenced off for the project, alternative source of biomass for many families is relatively a distance away. And the collection of this firewood is heavily reliant on women and children. We found also in this consultation that 3 households rely on 2 wells that are dug inside the project site for water. And if we proceed with fencing off the entire 13 hectares that is earmarked for renewable energy projects, including this project, it will block access of people living on the northern coast to the southern coast, wherein there are communally shared resources and facilities that people need to have access to. Facilities like schools and churches and meeting houses, so that if we fence off the area, people will have to find a long way around using coastal road to be able to travel to these facilities that they need. Some of them are retail stores that they need to go to almost on a daily basis, if not more than once a day, to buy basic needs. Now, as a result of these findings, the initial design of the project was reviewed, and adjustments were made to them so that we can integrate some of these and address some of these concerns. First one is the initial design involved a 10-meter buffer zone of vegetation between the road and the fence, the border fence for the project. And it was decided that we extend this buffer zone from 10 meters to 20 meters to preserve the vegetation that is surrounding the community, so that they can have a larger resource for firewood for their daily needs. The second one is we also added to the project design an enrichment tree planting program all around the boundary where there are open spaces and in vacant sections on the western part of the reserve, so that people will have, in the long term, a sustainable source of biomass for firewood. We also had to modify the alignment of PV arrays within the project area to avoid one household living in the site, as well as a cemetery, a community cemetery that was in the area that was set aside for the project. By all means necessary, it was decided that we will avoid physical displacement of people, not even one family. And that's why that was incorporated into the design. Now, the critical thing with safeguards for these projects and the integration of safeguards into the design of the project is, for me, the importance of consultation and the importance of timely disclosure of information to project affected people and stakeholders. Like I explained, a series of consultations that we've had with all stakeholders involved, and in particular, the local communities that are directly affected by the taking of the land that they rely on for the collection of firewood. Consultation is a mandatory requirement of environmental and social assessment for ADB and World Bank, and it's essential to identifying project impacts, especially of people that are particularly vulnerable to project impacts. And this consultation have to be meaningful. I mean, it's not just a matter of turning up and whoever is there. It has to be scheduled at a time that is suitable to people. And we did the consultation with the communities on the weekends, on Saturdays, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which was the time that they indicated would suit them. And as well, these consultations need to be ongoing, but starting very early in the early stages of the design of the project, so that there's the opportunity for us to identify these concerns and time to incorporate them into the design of the project. I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'm sure we'll come back to discussing some of these points later on in the webinar. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think that's just such a fantastic example of how environmental and social safeguards can actually contribute to better design and better outcomes for a project, and how we deliver development outcomes through physical infrastructure works using environmental and social safeguards. I'm just going to introduce our last speaker, and Tim, I'm sorry, we're going to, hopefully we don't have to rush you, but we may not be able to have the panel discussion that we'd hoped to have. Tim is an assistant director within the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, Safeguards and Quality Assurance team, where he works closely with project proponents and internal and external stakeholders to understand and manage environmental and social risk on AIFFP investments. AIFFP supports client organisations. Sorry, I'm just going to mute. So AIFFP supports client organisations in building their capacity and understanding environmental and social risk management and how to use international safeguard standards in a Pacific context. Prior to AIFFP, Tim was based in Indonesia and Vietnam, where he advised project developers and lenders on international environmental and social standards and their application in these markets, which probably gave him very good preparation for the work he's doing now. Tim's going to talk about how procurement actually matters so much in this big sphere of safeguards. Tim, it's where the rubber hits the road, I hear.
That's right, Joe. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Nice to be with you all this morning. As Joe said, I want to talk about sort of safeguards during project delivery and implementation and procurement, and offer some of AIF's or my observations on embedding this into delivery and sort of how that's managed. ENS assessments and the work that's done there is managed and embedded into the delivery of a project. AIF, we're relatively new to this space, so it gives us an opportunity to sort of do things differently in a way. I'll touch on some of our safeguard standards and the like later on, but essentially we, as similar to other development partners, we apply international environment social safeguards, our own DFAT environment and social safeguards. We engage with project stakeholders. We hire environment social experts and consultancies to support delivery of our projects, and essentially to help us understand ENS risk on a project, where there are opportunities, and allow the project to sort of move into implementation with an understanding of what they are. But that upfront process is sort of only half or even a quarter of the story, I'd say. So I might have some examples, I think, of how we are going about this, if you like. A quick introduction to the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific, or AIF. We've been operational since 2019 and build on DFAT's ongoing legacy as a trusted infrastructure partner for the Pacific. Our goal is to partner with Pacific governments and the private sector to deliver high quality, high impact, safeguarded infrastructure project in developments, and we do this through a window of $3 billion in loan funds and $500 million in grants. Next slide, please, Joe. And just quick, probably haven't got time to go into this, but that's just a quick snapshot, as I say, of the safeguards that find their way into our project and are adopted. Essentially, as I said earlier, the DFAT procedures, and then some of the international benchmarks that we apply are touched on there. The next slide. So this is designed to sort of depict an implementation cycle, if you like, and if you can imagine, perhaps on the left-hand side there, we've got all of the upfront environment social assessment work finding its way into the delivery bodies or stakeholders engaged in delivering the project. Then you've got your bidding documents and the contracts. And I think, you know, one of the challenges of safeguards, if you like, is it's a very distinct and discrete subject matter area. It quite often involves a whole really diverse range of people and expertise and approaches to E&S risk management and perspectives. And so, you know, often that work is somewhat ambiguous or can be difficult for or engineers or procurement specialists or lawyers to sort of, you know, understand in some instances. But most importantly, I think what is done in this upfront E&S assessment work is there are commitments that have sort of consequences and meaning, are designed to sort of manage risk, but at the same time, if not implemented properly, it can also expose the project to risk, if you like. Just quickly on the delivery bodies, I mean, I've got a sort of a snapshot of some of them there, but I think the point here is each will have its own sort of roles and level of operational control. And I think most importantly during delivery is this need to appropriately sort of apportion responsibility or risk throughout those delivery bodies. And suffice to say, it is a very dynamic environment that these projects are implemented and delivered in, meaning that more often than not, a lot of the assessment work has not necessarily been completed by the time agreements around project management units and construction supervision consultants are being put together. The purpose of just to point on the bidding documents, I mean, the purpose of highlighting this is just more so, this is a stage where the E&S assessment work needs to find its way into the bidding documents and those commitments. But more often than not, the bidding documents are prepared by you know, procurement specialists, engineers, there's legal teams involved, and there are particular industry norms and standards about how E&S expectations find their way into these bidding documents. And I'll touch on the example in a moment, but it's where the AIFFP social procurement policy is sort of an example of where, sorry, Joe, do you mind just going back before you move on to there? But is this example of how we have engaged with stakeholders, not the least of which being the borrower and project developers, to understand aspects such as local labour and capacity, and how that and other environment social aspects might find their way into the bidding documents, and particularly also this concept of value for money and how we influence the bid document design, and how some of those expectations find their way into this value for money equation. So Joe, next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm probably just going to touch on the middle point. I mean, all those are three sort of core pillars of AIFFP social procurement policy, and as I say, it dictates, I guess, essentially what AIFF are trying to, what we want our projects to look like and demonstrate, if you like. And the middle one being local content industry participation, and our projects, more often than not, will prescribe an industry, a local content industry participation plan, which will find its way into the special provisions of contracts. So it's something that we expect the contractor to deliver on and demonstrate during the bidding evaluation process how they're actually going to achieve that. I mean, it's important to note that other development partner systems, they already make reference to local labour and procurement, and it's probably more so sort of aspirational and guidance, whereas I think AIFF is taking the position that we want to use those existing mechanisms, if you like, but take it to the next level and to ensure it sort of becomes part of the project delivery and the opportunity that AIFF, we believe that we can deliver on, and it's probably very sort of, I think, happy to say that experience so far has been that that borrowers have really seen the appetite for this, and which has been really important to the uptake of this. It's important to note, though, that these changes and us, introducing expectations around local content industry participation introduce risk to the procurement process and project overall, and sort of alluding back to the earlier slide, that's that importance of engagement across the entire project team, as I say, the borrower in particular, to understand the opportunity that this will ideally deliver on. Next slide, please, Joe. Just this next one just quickly just gives you an example of how local content might be integrated into the into an evaluation criteria. So just one more on Joe. You'll see that we've got a sample of weighting here, and so we're trying to really sort of go beyond on cost, and it's often overweighted, I guess, position in the evaluation criteria, and in the context of delivering sort of high quality and high impact investments. We see aspects such as local content industry participation, and even heightened weightings around environment and social and health and safety management as being part of that evaluation criteria, to ensure that we're getting high quality contractors, but also contractors that we trust sort of understand the expectations of a particular project. And just one last example I'll give you is this one is more an example of, I guess, a dynamic environment where a safeguards related issue was picked up well into the project, and certainly after sort of commercial agreements had been signed. But this relates to AIF's $22 million investment in the Palau solar and battery storage project in Palau. AIF identified modern forced labour risks in the polysilicon supply chain of the preferred module supplier. And when I say preferred, I mean that they had won a contract and provide guarantees around performance of those particular modules. But we engaged with the borrower on this particular issue, and these challenges around supply chain risk in the solar industry have sort of been fairly prominent in the last 6 to 12 months, and we along with the borrower wanted to sort of signal to the market our intention to act on these particular issues and concerns where we identify them, and this particular one involved AIF mobilising a $4 million grant to support what was a higher quality procurement outcome, and then deliver that financing on time. So that's probably the most. I realise I kind of just rushed through it there, given the time we're working to. So Joe, I don't know if you still wanted to proceed with questions, but you're welcome to reach out to Joe and the team to get my details after this. If you have any questions about what I've presented.
Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry you felt like you had to rush. I actually really love that last case study that you shared, because it just is such a material example of making a difference through a supply chain decision, which is, I think, something that AIFFP is making huge strides in and leading the pack in that space at the moment. So thank you, Tim, for sharing. I am actually going to wrap up my part of the webinar today, and sadly we won't be able to facilitate a panel discussion, which I really had high hopes for, because I thought we had some really cool conversations ready to be had. But I might hand over to Dick to thank all the participants on this webinar, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I thank all our panelists. Before I wrap up, I'll just take a moment to mention the Humanitarian Innovation Award Hackathon on the 22nd and 24th of July, and any undergraduates on this webinar, I strongly recommend that you sign up for that. It's a unique experience, a very exciting, a lot of fun, and there are some very significant prizes. If you are, the details are given on that slide. If you're not a member of the Hub, you are invited to join. The link will be given. And finally, it's my pleasure to thank our moderator, Joe Baldesky, who put this together, and our 4 speakers, David Werra, Ross Butler, Sam Sasega, and Tim Simpson. Now I believe that all will agree this has been a first-class presentation on safeguards, which is a key to successful implementation of international development projects. And our panel members have defined and analysed safeguards and demonstrated the challenges and solutions with case studies. It's been excellent. Now, we have run over time, and I do apologise to our audience for that, but I believe that you are getting great information from some outstanding speakers. And what we are contemplating is putting together a second chapter or session of this event at a time in the not too distant future, which will be the panel only. And I think we will let you all know when that will occur, when we can organise our speakers again, because I think we will get a lot of value out of that, as Joe has indicated. In acknowledging Joe and our speakers, I also acknowledge our Hub General Manager and TECO expert, Melanie De Goya. So on behalf of the Warren Centre Humanitarian Engineering Hub, I thank you all